Tonight, somewhere in a museum, a 3,000-year-old human being is lying in a glass case. Their organs were removed and sealed in jars. Their body was packed with salt for 70 days. Their skin was rubbed with cedar oil, cinnamon, and myrrh. Their skull was filled with resin poured through their nose. Every step performed with the precision of a surgical procedure and the devotion of a religious ritual. The priests who prepared this body believed they were guaranteeing that person's eternal life. They had no way of knowing what was actually coming. That 3,000 years later, European merchants would dig these bodies up by the thousands, grind them into powder, and sell them to sick people as medicine. That painters would use them as brown paint. That Victorian aristocrats would throw dinner parties where the main entertainment was publicly unwrapping one. This is the story of mummification, not how the Egyptians made them, but what the rest of the world did to them after. It starts with a word. In ancient Persia, there was a substance called mumiya. It was a dark, tar-like mineral that seeped from the walls of rocks and cliffs in mountainous regions. It looked like bitumen. It smelled like pitch. Persian physicians believed it had healing properties. Applied topically to wounds, it seemed to reduce infection. Ground and mixed with liquids, it appeared to help with certain ailments. Mumiya meant roughly bitumen of the mountains. When this knowledge reached medieval European scholars through Arabic medical texts, something went wrong in translation. European doctors read about mumiya and its healing properties. Then they looked at Egyptian mummies, the preserved, dark, resin-soaked bodies being excavated from desert tombs, and made a catastrophic logical leap. The dark substance inside the mummies must be mumiya. They were wrong, completely wrong. The dark color of mummified tissue came from the desiccation and the resins used in preservation, not from bituminous mineral deposits. The substances had nothing to do with each other beyond superficial appearance. But the error was already in the medical literature, and once it was in the medical literature, it spread. By the 12th century, mummy, the word, now applied to the bodies themselves, had become a legitimate item in European pharmacies. Physicians prescribed it for headaches, fractures, paralysis, epilepsy, internal bleeding, bruising, nausea, and chest complaints. The German botanist Leonhard Fuchs recommended it in 1542. Francis I of France reportedly carried powdered mummy in a small pouch wherever he traveled, in case of emergency. Francis Bacon wrote about its uses. Shakespeare referenced it in Othello. For roughly 500 years, from the 12th century to the 18th, eating ground Egyptian mummies was not considered strange. It was medicine. Here is where you have to understand what the embalmers actually did, because the irony only lands when you grasp how extraordinary the process was. The Egyptians developed mummification over thousands of years, refining it to a peak of technical sophistication during the New Kingdom, around 1550 to 1070 BCE. What they achieved was not crude preservation. It was a precise, multi-stage process that could keep a human body recognizable for millennia. It began with removal of the organs. The brain came out first, pulled through the nose using a long, hooked instrument. The Egyptians did not believe the brain had any particular value. Thought, in their cosmology, lived in the heart. So the brain was usually discarded. What mattered were the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines. These were removed through an incision in the left side of the abdomen, washed in palm wine, packed with plant resin, wrapped in linen, and sealed inside 4 canopic jars. Each jar was protected by a different deity. Each organ had a specific guardian. Nothing was left to chance. The heart stayed in the body. It would be weighed in the afterlife. Then came natron. Natron is a naturally occurring salt compound found in dry lake beds throughout Egypt. The embalmers packed the body cavity with it, covered the entire corpse with it, and left it for 70 days. Not 69, not 71, 70. During those 70 days, the natron pulled every molecule of moisture from the tissue. What emerged was not a rotting body. It was a desiccated shell, dry as leather, stable enough to last indefinitely in the right conditions. After natron, the body was cleaned, rubbed with oils, cedar, palm, and sometimes linseed, to restore suppleness to the skin and prevent cracking. Then came the resins. Hot resin was poured into the body cavity and into the skull through the nasal passage. It hardened inside like amber. It sealed every internal surface against moisture and microbes. Then the wrapping. Hundreds of meters of linen strips wound methodically across every surface, with amulets placed at specific locations according to ritual texts. The wrapping alone could take 2 weeks. The entire process, start to finish, 70 days minimum, performed by trained specialists, governed by religious protocol, accompanied by prayer at every stage. This was not preservation by accident, it was preservation by design. And what the Europeans were grinding up and swallowing was all of it: the resins, the natron, the oils, the linen, the desiccated tissue, mixed together and sold by weight. Physicians debated which parts were most potent. Some believed the flesh itself held the medicine. Others argued it was the resins that had absorbed into the tissue over centuries. A few maintained that the older the mummy, the stronger the dose. The demand was enormous. And Egypt, it turned out, had an enormous supply. By the 16th century, the mummy trade was a formal commercial industry. Merchants in Alexandria sold them by the pound. European ships arriving in Egyptian ports listed mummy among their cargo alongside spices and textiles. Physicians back in London, Paris, and Antwerp had standing orders with suppliers. The demand quickly outpaced the supply of ancient mummies, so suppliers began to improvise. Contemporary accounts from the 16th and 17th centuries describe dealers mummifying recently deceased Egyptians, plague victims, criminals, executed prisoners, and selling them as ancient artifacts. The French physician Guy de la Fontaine traveled to Alexandria specifically to investigate and documented merchants openly admitting they were selling fabricated mummies. Bodies dead only months, not millennia, dressed in resin and linen and sold as genuine antiquities. Some European physicians noticed the problem. A German doctor wrote in the 1580s that the mummies being sold were obvious fakes, that the smell was wrong, that the color was wrong. He recommended that patients avoid Egyptian mummy entirely and seek out bitumen from the mountains instead. The original mumiya, the substance the whole confusion had started with. Nobody listened. The trade continued for another century. Medicine was not the only market. In the 17th century, European painters discovered that ground mummy produced a rich, warm brown pigment, unlike anything available from mineral sources. They called it mummy brown, and it became fashionable in the studios of England and continental Europe. It had a specific quality, a translucent warmth that painters valued for shadows, for the glazing of skin tones, for the deep earth of landscape backgrounds. Pre-Raphaelite painters used it extensively. Some art historians believe it may be present in works by Rubens and Van Dyck, though chemical analysis of those specific paintings hasn't confirmed it definitively. But it was not discontinued because of ethics. It was discontinued because the supply ran out. A London paint manufacturer in the 1960s reportedly told a customer that they had just used up their last Egyptian mummy and could not guarantee they could restock. The customer was reportedly disturbed by this. The product was quietly retired. And then there were the unwrapping parties. Victorian England developed a specific form of aristocratic entertainment around Egyptian mummies. A host would acquire a mummy, often purchased through legitimate antiquities dealers, and invite guests for an evening of unwrapping. The mummy would be laid on a table. Guests would gather. The bandages would be removed, layer by layer, to reveal what was underneath. Thomas Pettigrew, a surgeon and Egyptologist, became so famous for performing these events that he earned the nickname Mummy Pettigrew. He unwrapped mummies in front of audiences that included dukes and bishops. When he died, he was buried in a mummy-shaped sarcophagus. Whether that was irony or tribute is not entirely clear. The Egyptian priests who prepared these bodies were not naive about mortality. They understood completely that the body would be left behind while the soul moved on. That was the whole point. The mummification ritual was not about preserving the person. It was about preserving the vessel, keeping it intact so the soul could return to it, recognize it, have somewhere to come home to. They prayed over every organ. They wrapped every finger individually. They spoke the name of the deceased aloud at each stage of the process, because in Egyptian theology, to speak a name was to sustain a life. They did all of this so that the person would not be lost. And then 3,000 years passed, and someone dug them up and ate them for a headache. There is a version of this story where the Europeans are simply villains, but the more accurate version is stranger than that. The people grinding up mummies believed completely that they were using medicine. They had physicians' manuals that said so. They had centuries of accumulated medical authority behind them. The entire system was built on a mistranslation that nobody caught for 500 years. It is a good reminder that the things we are most confident about, the things we consider settled, obvious, beyond question, are often just assumptions that haven't been challenged yet. The Egyptians were trying to make something last forever. They succeeded, just not in the way they intended.